Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Recent Reads. Today I'm going to be talking about The Drowned World by G Ballard from 1962. I've been on a really fun spree of reading SF from the 60s and 70s recently. After many attempts at trying to broaden my reading of SF and not finding what I'm looking for so much, I'm finally finding it in several different authors. Recently did a video on Philip K. Dick's Ubik and getting more into Dick, and now I'm finally getting more into Ballard, somebody that's been on my list for a while. I had read some of his short stories many years ago alongside other new wave writers in 60s and 70s collections, and I loved his work. His name stood out. I particularly remember the Drowned Giant being one of my favorite stories, but I just never had gotten around to reading his novels. And I have to say, I'm probably going to be more interested in these early sort of disaster or catastrophe novels that he wrote. I think there's 4 of them that kind of correspond to the 4 elements. In here, it's the element of water. I think his later social novels I suspect, are going to be a little more along the lines of people like Philip Roth and Pynchon and different. I'm sure those readers of Ballard are going to be like, no, it's totally different. But there's a thing about those types of social novels where it's all those authors are really good writing. Don DeLillo and all these people, great writers. And I've read stuff by each of them and enjoyed it, but it's not my favorite. And they get grouped together a lot with an author of mine who is a favorite, and that's Cormac McCarthy. And if you know his work and their work, then I think you can see the difference there. And McCarthy's way more to my taste, and Ballard is more in that type of area in a novel like this. Although I do definitely want to read High Rise. I'm just not sure I'm going to read much of the rest of that. And I think I will really enjoy High Rise. And I think it's going to be fascinating to see Ballard do what he's doing in a disaster novel like this, but put in a totally different type of setting. I think he's going to do similar things, and it's going to be pretty awesome. And one of many reasons that I prefer McCarthy over those other authors is that there's just way more of an emphasis on the landscape, more than human things, flora, fauna, and so on. And while Ballard is famous for having said something along the lines of, SF is often about outer space, I want to explore inner space, he is doing that in this novel. He's exploring interiority through exteriority and their interrelation and mirroring and so on. And it's brilliant. It's fascinating. And Martin Amis says a few interesting things in his intro here, which I didn't read till afterwards. I never read the intros till after I've finished. And Martin Amis, incidentally, is another one of those authors I've read a bit, and I liked it, but, like with Roth and Pynchon and whoever, it just doesn't grab me as much as other things. But Amos says in this intro that the fusion of mood and setting, the mapping of a landscape of the troubled mind, this is what really matters in Ballard. And that is exactly what he's doing in this novel, but it is truly of the mind, the mood, and so on with the setting, with the land, in a significant way, because you could do that and not really care about the outer reality, the land and so on, and have no real eye for it. What you're really after is the interior landscape. But I think Ballard's interested in both, for sure. And indeed, that fusion of them, and that is what this novel is all about, a very slow fusion. It's very cool. And Amos also says in his intro that in the end, the tensile strength of the drowned world derives not from its action, but from its poetry. And this is another way in which I like a writer like this and find him akin to McCarthy, is that there is an intentional poeticization of the language, of descriptions, and so on. And it is that intentional poeticization, that's a really hard word to say, poeticization. The intentionality of that produces the strengths of the novel. And it's not just sort of ornamentation for ornamentation's sake any more than it is in McCarthy. It does real work, and it has to do with what it's all about. One thing that's funny about the language, though, is that the characters all speak and basically act in this extremely posh way, very English, middle class. And while normally I have no interest in such things and generally can't read fiction that deals with that kind of social class, the particular tone that Ballard has gave me massive nostalgia because I'm used to it from having read tons and tons of C.S. Lewis when I was younger. Another posh English guy, although he's kind of Irish really, but an Oxfordian sort of fellow. And such a weird thing as this like lower class, working class sort of like kid from the Midwestern US in the 80s. My two formative authors that I read as a preteen were Edgar Allan Poe and C.S. Lewis. And they just like captured my imagination. And they made me aware of writing, that there's a thing called writing and that I wanted to write. And so inevitably, as I set pen to paper over the years, like I'm writing in this bizarre, semi-posh, verbose way, which is not like my background at all, and it comes across awkward. It's not great. Has often felt more like a curse than a blessing, but I'm slowly finding ways to kind of turn that to best benefit. But anyway, this gave me, sort of nostalgia for reading C.S. Lewis and things like that. And this is another thing that I was noticing that as I was reading it and charmed and stuff by it. And then sure enough, Amos mentions it in the intro as well. He says that the characters talk like a troupe of British school teachers hoisted out of the 1930s. Damn shame about old Bodkin. Capital. Touche, Alan. And they do talk like that. It's so funny. Though not completely. It's not just that kind of language. That would take you out of it a bit. There's some effort toward naturalistic and, contemporary 60s sort of language. And it works, reasonably well on that level. And it's not a massively dialogue-heavy novel. There are sort of long disquisitions from various characters describing the sort of theoretical parameters of what's happening. And those work for their own sake. And you don't need a particularly well-realized, realistic dialogue style for that. But you do notice the posh English qualities of the prose from time to time. But even the way he kind of sets up his characters, because it's not a character-rich novel. I mean, they're not bad, they're not lame, but they're just, they're not deep, well-realized characters, and they're kind of like set in place to be these figures for the story. To some degree, it's not really a good versus evil story, really at all, and it's not a goodies and baddies story, but there's a surface veneer of goodies and baddies in it. Again, Amos mentions that it has a lot of boys' adventure story qualities to it within this very sophisticated level of discourse and style. But having some of the long, theoretical explanations from characters and the almost pantomime baddies or something also reminded me of C.S. Lewis, especially like That Hideous Strength and stuff like that. So simply put, it's about a flooded earth and how this post-diluvian setting is affecting people's minds. And the opening chapters, I thought, did a great job of just setting all this up. It's a pretty slow pace, and I think it's a pace that really works. I had this sense of being like, yeah, okay, I'm settling in. You're gonna just kind of evoke this world. And I've spent too much time making a little fun of some of his writing. He's a very good writer. This is great prose. It's not perfect. It feels like an early novel. It feels like he's reaching and trying to find his style, and he takes a lot of chances, a lot of swings at metaphors and similes and poetic language, and maybe only half of them land, but the ones that land are really good, and the ones that don't necessarily land are still fun, and you appreciate the effort, and they're cool in their way. They just feel a little awkward, but that's the kind of swing that I can really appreciate, the attempt at a flex that I like. So you feel in good hands in these opening chapters, like here's a great writer at work. And particularly, I think what struck me was, of course you've got there's like this rank vegetation all around. Everything has grown to much greater size, and just all things flora and fauna have kind of taken over this central belt of the planet, and humans are now mostly living at the poles where it's livable temperature-wise and it's too hot in the middle. But this group of scientists sent by the government are down in that middle bit, taking pretty vague measurements to try to make some kind of vague solution I don't think any of that was really made clear in the novel, and it's not really meant to be. It's just like, here's what humans would do inevitably as a response. And there are definite echoes with Brian Aldiss's Hot House, which came out just like a year before. I think somebody in a comment somewhere said that this was almost like a prequel to Hot House, which is much further on when humans have sort of devolved and the whole place is taken over by flora and so on. In my opinion, this is a much better novel than Hot House, and he makes more interesting philosophical moves than Aldous did as well. But even with all that type of description of the land and stuff being good and interesting, what struck me, and I think is some of the genius of the novel, some of the like, okay, there's a reason why this has made a mark and left a mark, is this whole kind of simple image of imagining being in a boat or some kind of floating craft and looking down through the water when it's clear and seeing the lower levels of tall high-rise buildings and other things like streets and street lamps and smaller buildings and signs and things way down there in the water, and also being overgrown with various sorts of watery flora. And it's just such a striking image, and he just sort of very casually keeps coming back to it, and it's great. It's really good. It's a really disorienting, reorienting type of image that really speaks to, you know, sort of post-human type things, but through a recontextualization of the stuff and infrastructure of civilization. And characters are staying in the top levels, you know, the top 3 or 4 floors of these tall buildings temporarily. The main character is staying in the Ritz in London. You eventually discover it's London, way up in these high levels, looking down over all this transformed landscape. And from this place of disorientation, reorientation, the novel very slowly builds out its strangeness, its psychedelia even, through the way the characters are affected in their minds and how they begin to basically late in the novel it calls it a call. They feel this like call from the non-human ambient, and its reinstantiation of primordial, even maybe prehistorical, pre-human conditions calling to their minds and kind of transforming them from the inside out so that their interiority begins to mirror that exteriority. And in that sense, it's a genuinely speculative novel. It's fascinating. It's really cool the way it says, look, what would happen if humanity as a whole were more or less suddenly, certainly on the geologic timescale, this would be suddenly immersed in prehistoric conditions. And it just plays that out. It's great. I love it. And in that sense, it really is a novel for our time. You know, just looking at things like how that interval of COVID and the isolation it enforced and so on affected our minds and is continuing to have results, implications. Yeah, and it just brings up all the ecological stuff, all the issues of the Anthropocene. And that's what I like about it, is it imagines, you know, what we often think about. What if the planet took back over forcefully, and in this case, rather than just devouring or annihilating humanity, it reverses the Anthropocene, in the Anthropocene we have put our geological footprint on the planet and transformed it in that way. And here the planet imprints itself onto our minds in a way mirroring the way we transformed the body of the planet. The planet's body transforms our minds, and to such a degree that we end up like cooperating willingly with this reversal process, with the return of the non-human to ascendancy and the re-enveloping of the human within all things. Basically the overthrow of anthropocentrism, where we put ourselves at the center and now find ourselves radically decentralized, contextualized, and indeed in danger of extinction. Speaking of like reversals of what we've done, now we're the ones becoming extinct in this book, it seems. But again, imagine it having such an effect on our minds that we go with that flow and do the exact opposite of everything we've been doing, you know, like where we just couldn't leave things alone. Now we're being forced to leave things alone, and we're like, yeah, that's cool. It's a great thought experiment, this novel. And just listen to how it describes some of this move that humans make in this way. As I say, not not all the characters are doing this yet, but there's this implication that this is spreading amongst humans. But, so they're trying to do business as usual and sort things out through science and civilized infrastructure and so on. But a few characters involved in that very project are starting to slowly opt out, and they're gonna stay in this hot region and probably even travel further south towards the equator where it's even hotter. And they're deliberately not even trying to steal supplies, or not too many anyway, or there's ways in which they could set up a comfortable human living as they've known it for a little while to come, not forever, but for some time. And they don't even try to do that, and they realize they're just leaving behind all the apparatus of civilization, and not just comforts, but kind of survival abilities and so on. And the novel calls it a reverse Crusoeism, like Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, a novel I happen to have read for some teaching that I've done. And that is a prime example of how to do a ton of conceptual work in a simple 2-word phrase, reverse Crusoeism. And when you know that story, part of it is that when he's shipwrecked, the ship is conveniently just out there on some rocks, and he keeps swimming out to it and getting items from the ship, and spends a lot of the novel just listing out the items that he found. And people have made fun of this and call him a grocer and stuff. But as someone who's interested in object-oriented ontology, those lists do a lot of work, and they're actually really cool. But I can totally understand how people don't vibe with that. But they are all the objects of civilization as we know it, and they enable him to live a somewhat comfortable lifestyle on this, as he is abandoned on this island. And in this novel, not only, it's not just that they don't have that option, it's that to the degree that they even have that option, they forego it. They choose not to pursue that path, to make the list of things that will keep them going. And the novel is not without its lists, its listing, its object-oriented ontology, sort of continual itemizing of objects and things all around us. But it does so in a more so-called post-human direction. I'll say some more about that in a minute. But the novel says that this inverted Crusoeism, the deliberate marooning of himself without the assistance of a gear-laden carrack wrecked on a convenient reef, raised few anxieties in Kieran's mind. And the carrack referred to there as an old ship. But as I said, it's a deliberate marooning of himself, and without the convenience of going and getting stuff off that ship. And it didn't trouble him. That's what I mean. The humans are going along with this. And it just builds out the conceptual idea from there. By talking about, the characters talk amongst themselves, they're kind of trying to theorize what's happening. And it's suggested that they're sort of descending into what they call neuronic time, like neurons, like the brain. Neuronic time, which is another one of the key conceptions of the novel. It says that as the character makes this deliberate move, he would be abandoning the conventional estimates of time in relation to his own physical needs and entering the world of total neuronic time, where the massive intervals of the geological time scale calibrated his existence. So it's about entering into willingly that massive scale of non-human time that outsizes us, that was a sense of what was going on long before we ever arrived on the scene, and presumably long after. Later in the novel, a character says, "Insofar as we are part of the planet, a piece of the main, we too are returning. This is our zone of transit, where we are reassimilating our own biological pasts. That's why we have chosen to remain here." So reassimilating to the whole scope of biological processes in our very psychology. And I think that's an important point about the novel. I said that they are descending into this time. I think a better word would be subscending into this bigger scale of time, which is a very obscure word and even hard to sort of Google and find a definition for. I came across it through Timothy Morton's book, Dark Ecology, and some other people are working with it in similar theoretical ways. And Morton says it's an old word from theology about incarnation and stuff, and I haven't even been able to find it in theology so far. But where to ascend or descend implies kind of can imply like leaving behind something to go up or down. Subsending can imply that you are taking what you are and what is here with you into the descent, so that what you are and what is here is transformed through that movement into this greater reality. And that's what's happening to the characters. Now I have to say, I feel that possibly Ballard gets his ideas a little mixed up, or just not as coherent and realized as they could be, and that, that's fine. It's hard to get it all put together in a novel, but sometimes it feels a little bit like he's riffing and not thinking through some of the things he's saying. So in that same part where it says that the massive intervals of the geological time scale calibrated his existence, it goes on to say, here, 1,000,000 years was the shortest working unit, and problems of food and clothing became as irrelevant as they would have been to a Buddhist contemplative lotus squatting before an empty rice bowl under the protective canopy of the 1,000,000-headed cobra of eternity. And both his prose and his ideas get a little dicey there. I mean, I love that idea of the cobra of eternity and everything. I just don't felt that it totally landed. And it feels a bit shallow, his quick summoning of a Buddhist or a Buddhist idea to ratify what he's saying. And I like the idea of the 1,000,000 years being the smallest unit, but that food and clothing become irrelevant, it just doesn't quite work as an idea. And he had something really good going, and if you just worked at it a little longer, I think he could have made it more convincing. But again, I appreciate the flex, the reach. But an example, just a few pages later, of him doing both the ideas and the prose a little more solidly, I think, would be where it describes that he's listening to a couple other people working on the government project trying to discuss something. I think they're trying to find somebody who's run away, and they're trading back and forth ideas that basically his mind just starts to wander from that civilized project. So while they're talking, it says that Kieran's looked around at the water eddying slowly past the cinema. A few branches and clumps of weed drifted along on the northward current, the bright sunlight masking the molten mirror of the surface. The water drummed against the portico beneath his feet, beating slowly against his mind, and setting up a widening circle of interference patterns as if crossing it at an opposite direction to its own course of flow. He watched a succession of wavelets lapping at the sloping roof, wishing that he could leave the kernel and walk straight down into the water, dissolve himself and the ever-present phantoms which attended him like sentinel birds in the cool bower of its magical calm, in the luminous dragon-green, serpent-haunted sea. And throughout the novel, all these things, water and sunlight and different things going on, are always like quote-unquote beating against the minds of the character and influencing them. And it's kind of a metaphor for the whole novel in that way, where it says that this non-human influence is always setting up a widening circle of interference patterns, as if crossing it at an opposite direction to its own course of flow. And as those more than human interference patterns keep coming in and going against the current of the civilized project, some of these characters begin to listen to that pattern and let it become the new pattern. Like, oh, okay, yeah, let's go that direction instead. And to some degree, some of the bulk of the novel is about those characters kind of just being sitting around, walking about, going, yeah, things are different, and I'm okay with that. Which is cool. I mean, it's an interesting way to play out a speculative situation. Why not? And he's a good enough writer to carry it off. And a lot of their succumbing to this subsendence is achieved through their dreams. They keep dreaming of the primordial reality, as well as slowly seeing it around themselves. So in another passage where Kieran's is dreaming, and he mentions another character, another scientist called Bodkin, who is the main one who comes up with this theory of neuronic time. It says, the light drummed against his brain, bathing the submerged levels below his consciousness, carrying him downwards into warm, pellucid depths where the nominal realities of time and space ceased to exist. Guided by his dreams, he was moving backwards through the emergent past, through a succession of ever stranger landscapes centered upon the lagoon, each of which, as Bodkin had said, seemed to represent one of his own spinal levels. At times, the circle of water was spectral and vibrant, at others, slack and murky, the shore apparently formed of shale like the dull metallic skin of a reptile. Yet again, the soft beaches would glow invitingly with a glossy carmine sheen, the sky warm and limpid, the emptiness of the long stretches of sand total and absolute, filling him with an exquisite and tender anguish. He longed for this descent through archaeopsychic time to reach its conclusion, repressing the knowledge that when it did, the external world around him would have become alien and unbearable. So that's the subjective experience they're going through. And I feel like the last time I saw somebody use the word pellucid was in C.S. Lewis, side note, a word I love. But yeah, that last bit about him waking to an alien world because becoming so accustomed to this return through time in his inner world is confusing based on what I've described the novel being about and what I think it is about. And I can only assume that it's referring to the civilized world that they're trying to maintain, and that's what he's going to find alien and unbearable, and which is why he's choosing to abandon it. Yeah, and so halfway through the book, Ballard needs to get some action going. It can't just be people kind of wandering about giving in to this. It could have been a shorter novel and just about that. And when he does this, it's a really fun attempt. It's very cool in its sort of idea of what to do there, but I don't really think it comes off very well. Basically it's that whole post-apocalyptic thing where, some people become opportunists and marauders within this setting, and so you get some megalomaniac character coming in who has other people in his thrall doing his work for him and all this, Negan, Walking Dead type stuff. But, people have done this kind of thing much better than in this book. It's not Ballard's forte, it seems to me, at least here. Maybe he does better with it elsewhere. But I have to say, here's where we come up against a troubling aspect of the novel. It came across to me as out and out racist, just out and out colonialist racist. It was really weird to see that attitude so blatantly in Ballard. And I don't know what he might be like in his later books. But this sort of great white character who comes around menacing them has in his employ and in his thrall a group of black men. And the descriptions of them just seemed completely racist, just that scientific racism, phrenology type stuff. And I kept waiting for that to be a critique of this character's attitude or something, as even very, very subtly, satirizing or subverting it somehow. And maybe that's in there, maybe I missed it, but it just didn't come across to me. It was never quite realized, and it seemed the other characters and the narrator kind of all shared in that view. Yeah, so that was really uncomfortable. Not good. So before I just out and out condemn this book as racist or something, I'll have to sit with it a while longer and see what other people say and stuff. But at the very least, there's a flag there. There's what's going on here? I'm not sure this is great. Didn't look great to me. And the novel does make this great white character who has them in thrall and everything a total villain. He's not sympathetic at all, but that doesn't take away from how the black characters are described. So, and this guy has all these alligators in his employ, so to speak, as it were, and there's no explanation to why this massive host of alligators are following him around and obeying his commands, and they're part of how he controls the situation. I mean, it's just pure Boys Adventure silliness at this point. And it was fun and a great idea. It just, as several chapters of this went on, it was I was genuinely getting a little bored. Right when it's supposed to be most exciting, it's just it's just so unmotivated and unrealized, that it just didn't totally work for me. But it was fine. I could keep turning the pages, no problem. But there is one thing that happens late in the novel due to this character and stuff that really wowed me. And I suppose at this point, if you haven't read the novel and you think you will, you might not want to listen on for spoilers. I mean, I think the impact of it will be less if you know that it's coming, but it's not a big plot spoiler type of thing. But I was not expecting it, and it was pretty well realized. And it's, again, a kind of a fantastical, almost silly thing that I'm not sure could really happen, and certainly wasn't set up to explain how it would happen. I mean, there were nods toward explaining it, and that's fine. But here's the spoiler bit. Basically, he manages with his group of workers to de-flood a portion of the city, and sort of build up these ramparts or dams and suck out all the water. And the visual and sensorial reversal that creates quite suddenly in that moment really grabbed me. I just was not expecting it. And then it was pretty well realized. It was just like, whoa, that's crazy, because the whole novel has been about looking down through the water, seeing all these buildings and streets underwater now. And suddenly that's like in a moment sort of erased. But of course, it's not erased. What you get when that happens is a big, nasty sewer of the former world. And it uses sewage language to describe the smell and so on. You know, all that plant life and stuff, and kelp and twining plants of various sorts and so on, is now covering everything in a very soggy, gross way. And it even talks about how before it had been quite beautiful seeing all that plant life around the buildings. Again, just a great dreamy post-apocalyptic image that the novel creates as one of its central images, and then just tries to rip it away. It's actually really effective for the whole conceptual aspect of the novel, because if you were to suddenly be able to reverse this huge earth process that's slowly transforming the world and our own minds, this is what you would get, a very ambiguous at best result. And it's basically really gross and disorienting yet again, but in a different way. You know, and they carry on about in the city trying to loot, and they're like partying, and again it's supposed to be all crazy and, you know, I don't know, Lord of the Flies or something throughout all this part, and it just doesn't entirely work for me. But that central image of the city being deflooded was really powerful, and kind of speaks to that civilization project of trying once again through anthropocentric orientations and means to, you know, take control back, you know. And you can only do it in this tiny limited way. I mean, there's this implication that maybe they'll be able to reproduce this elsewhere and slowly get back things back on track. But in addition to it being so gross, it's also sabotaged by one of these characters who is going along with the change in things, who manages to conveniently set off a bomb that breaks one of the dams and just lets it all flood back in, and manages to get himself killed in the process. And that's kind of spectacular too. None of this is like massively described with descriptive prose, but it's concisely described and sometimes just implied enough that your mind really takes on these images of deflooding and then reflooding. But yeah, when it all gets resubmerged, it's just such a metaphor for our attempts to, you know, reverse this thing that we've caused, and it's like way too late in the game to reverse it. And in that sense, I don't think it's a hopeless novel, but it's saying we can reach a point of hopelessness, at least in terms of trying to make things right through the means that we've used so far. And I should mention here that whilst there's this emphasis on all this rank growth, and with that, there's especially in the earlier part of the novel this ubiquitous presence of iguanas, large iguanas everywhere, and large insects. You know, things are kind of going through a de-evolution where they're going back to larger sizes and things like that. Almost surprisingly, the novel doesn't become sort of a carnivorous carnival of flesh-eating death and bloodshed, as you might expect. Again, I don't think this is probably Ballard's forte. That's a different kind of novel, and that's really the direction that Aldous' hothouse goes in. And strangely, Ballard just stays at this like kind of calm, contemplative level about the whole thing that totally works. However, the novel is kind of based in principle on the idea of the predominance of the predation cycle, that the whole history of the world is this very bloody affair. And it talks about at one point how the characters, in seeing these primordial conditions, are getting deja vu from their biological memory. And it says, however selective the conscious mind may be, most biological memories are unpleasant ones, echoes of danger and terror. Nothing endures for so long as fear. Everywhere in nature one sees evidence of innate releasing mechanisms, literally millions of years old, which have lain dormant through thousands of generations but retained their power undiminished. And it goes on to give examples of rats fearing the shadow of a hawk, even if you just make a paper hawk over their cage and they've never seen one in their life, or our fear of spiders and snakes and so on, even when we actually encounter so few that are actually poisonous. And it says, simply because we all carry within us a submerged memory of the time when the giant spiders were lethal and when the reptiles were the planet's dominant life form. And they theorize that this isn't just in our brains, but in our spinal column and in just like kind of cellular memory. And this does connect with some things I've seen that Jung talks about, us containing the consciousness of all living things within our own collective unconscious through the process of evolution. And as it says, every step we've taken in our evolution is a milestone inscribed with organic memories. And goes on to say, just as psychoanalysis reconstructs the original traumatic situation in order to release the repressed material, so we are now being plunged back into the archaeopsychic past, uncovering the ancient taboos and drives that have been dormant for epochs. The brief span of an individual life is misleading. Each one of us is as old as the entire biological kingdom, and our bloodstreams are tributaries of the great sea of its total memory. The uterine odyssey of the growing fetus recapitulates the entire evolutionary past, and its central nervous system is a coded time scale, each nexus of neurons and each spinal level marking a symbolic station, a unit of neuronic time. And this is something I'm still studying, so what I'm going to say about that is very tentative and provisional. But this is a very widespread idea, and not least amongst like YouTubers and podcasters who are covering literature like this, that basically everything about our evolutionary past is just this bloody nightmare. And for us to reconnect to that in any way, or more consciously connect to it, is perhaps to end up enacting that bloody nightmare more consciously and in a less civilized way ourselves. As it says, we're going to uncover ancient taboos and drives. Like we're just going to become really transgressive. And in a part that I forgot to read in there, that it's saying that all this inscribed in our brain and our cells and so on, that each is a record of 1,000 decisions taken in the face of a sudden physical chemical crisis. And it's all predicated on this idea that evolution practically strictly works by such crises, like basically by trauma, nature red in tooth and claw, as the saying goes. And it kind of implies that our attempts at politics, ethics, and so on is kind of a veneer over the top of something more violent and aggressive, that those are just the means by which things change and mutate and evolve. And my suspicion for a long time is that this just leaves out way too much about biology and how it works, and evolution and how it works. And I've definitely seen, people talking about biosemiotics, which I've mentioned before, and that things like natural play, as they say, are as evident in the way things evolve as things like natural selection, meaning that things are not just competing, but they're often also collaborating, cooperating, and that there's like a mutual reading and interpretation and form of sort of game playing and so on going on between all things as well that drives evolution. And to the degree that much more complex picture of evolution is closer to the truth, then our minds, in a speculative scenario like this, becoming reabsorbed in a much greater way to all of that, to that whole process, would involve not just bloody competition and these sorts of things and the whole nightmare, as it were, but all the rest of it, whatever that may be. Who's to say that under those conditions, we might not simply become more inhumane to each other, or maybe check out, or these sorts of options that you often see. Maybe we would become freshly collaborative in strange new ways that we had never imagined. I'm just throwing that out there. If you've got some good theoretical chops to show me how the idea is just totally bogus, let me know. And even if you don't have good theoretical chops, but you've got some thoughts about that, comment. Let's talk about this. But I don't know. I think this connects to certain feminist ideas and so on. I need to reread this essay, but I'm always struck by Ursula Le Guin's essay, The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, in which she critiques the 2001 Space Odyssey idea of the sort of phallic rocket shooting through space to go where no man's gone before and discover all these things, and maybe even discover, as a lot of this kind of stuff suggests, our pointlessness in the universe or whatever, and contrast that to a more feminine picture of not just hunting, but the gathering part and the work that women did that wasn't with swords and spears. It was with, sort of bags and baskets, collecting things and so on, and collecting our stories and stuff like that. It just suggests that evolution may not be all about the spear, so to speak, the tooth, the claw, that there's a lot else going on there. And even if the planet should forcefully take things back over and imprint on us in this way, what it would imprint might be truly strange, not something we can anticipate, and that maybe this whole idea that it's red in tooth and claw is an anthropocentric idea. And I'm not denying, the predation cycle and the kind of horror and terror of that in a way, but just because that bloodiness is part of reality, and it is even crucial to it, and it is, doesn't mean that that's the whole of what's going on or the central point. And a thing that Donna Haraway says over and over again is, learning to live well and die well together, and that a lot of ecological balance has to do with things being able to eat other things in a balanced way and stuff like that. So I'm just, putting a pin there, just saying, like, let's keep thinking about that. Let's not just always take this on board as like the given thing. The universe is bleak and horrifying, and there may be beauty in the midst of it, but ultimately we're just food for the greater processes and these sorts of things. And we are that, but that doesn't, even if we are food for the greater processes, does that mean we're meaningless? Is a fish meaningless because we're eventually going to eat it and so on? Or we might, if we're good fishermen and fisherwomen. And don't get me wrong, I feel the aesthetic badassery of a bleak point of view or nihilism or whatever it may be. And sometimes I find it very convincing, both on a personal level and an, more generally intellectual level. I feel that pull. I get that. I do. I really, really do. And I'm not saying we need to live in some make-believe where we just pretend that's not the case. I'm more asking, is that the case? And there are lots of different kinds of answers to that. I think the fear is that there will be some dogmatic religious answer to that. And that's just not all that's out there in ways to engage this whole question. Nor am I saying that kind of thing has to be entirely excluded either. That's all part of the conversation. But yeah, interesting stuff. But I love how he contrasts what's happening in their minds and stuff to this civilized project of trying to right the ship, so to speak, where he says, the tacit assumption made by the UN Directorate that within the new perimeters described by the Arctic and Antarctic circles, life would continue much as before, with the same social and domestic relationships, by and large the same ambitions and satisfactions, was obviously fallacious, as the mounting floodwater and temperature would show when they reached the so-called polar redoubts. A more important task than mapping the harbors and lagoons of the external landscape was to chart the ghostly deltas and luminous beaches of the submerged Neuronic continents. And yeah, I'm really down with that, and that's what this novel does. And it might prove eerily prescient, or I suppose it has, it depends on how you look at things currently, but also how things develop in the future. But, many theorists, again, the likes of Timothy Morton and Donna Haraway and others, are saying we can't do things business as usual. It's way too late for that. And that's what got us here to begin with. If we don't attend to our imaginations, no amount of external work that we do, technological or otherwise, is going to change things. Because we'll still be operating on the mindset that got us here, operating on its basis. You have to change that mindset. And you have to stop being anthropocentric and hubristic about it as well. There's just this inevitable humility that's required, where you might just have to go down like this and just say, look, everything's changing, our minds are changing. Let's attend to that. Let's pay attention to that. There's this whole idea of accelerationism, which I don't fully understand yet. I hear it a lot. And I've heard it described through pretty good ways, but I don't totally get it. But, kind of speeding up all these processes to and through their ruin to whatever's next, I guess, maybe, sort of. But Timothy Morton talks about, being a decelerationist, that we need to slow down, not in terms of like be hippie return to nature sort of stuff, as it were, which is built on so many false assumptions. But just being able to slow down our thinking a bit and attend to things and the way they feel and what that could mean and so on. And I think that's the kind of thing this novel is promoting and performing. And you can't just like hope that, that's going to be our solution. That's what will produce the solution, because then you won't have slowed down enough and you won't be paying attention enough and you won't experience the transformation we need of imagination. You have to like release and say all bets are off and like, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but let's go there. Let's allow our minds to be rewired, remapped, whatever. But the final chapter or chapters of the novel returns to kind of where things started after this interval of almost silly adventure that has its moments and its qualities that are good. And that interval is effective in making the return to how the novel started, with people just giving in to this change in the world, makes it impactful. So that while the early chapters were already kind of seducing you into this whole project, this whole theoretical conceit, when it returns after that interval that shows the failure in a fairly spectacular way of the civilized project, and Kieran's takes off further to the south, it really brings it home and it really has an impact. It's just like, whoa. And this return to the primordial in the mind is about moving into the future. As it says in one part of the book, both the past and the present no longer offered a viable existence. His commitment to the future, so far one of choice and plagued by so many doubts and hesitations, was now absolute. And so in this final chapter it says that, obscured by the events of the past week, all that adventure interval, the archaic sun in his mind beat again continuously with its immense power, its identity merging now with that of the real sun visible behind the rain clouds. Relentless and magnetic, it called him southward to the great heat and submerged lagoons of the equator. And that's what this novel is all about. Characters responding to that magnetic call of the more than human and possibly the post-human. And the whole novel is, somewhat dream-oriented, but the final chapter just feels like it just goes into full dreamscape in a way, into this phantasmagorical land in which humans are a sort of tenuous effervescence at best. And it ends somewhat surprisingly with this theological language. And I can't yet decide what I think it's kind of doing. It says that as Kieran enters the jungle, within a few days was completely lost, following the lagoons southward through the increasing rain and heat, attacked by alligators and giant bats, a second Adam searching for the forgotten paradises of the reborn sun. So even if you don't know that this is a biblical reference, I mean, you know from Adam, but you may not know the phrase second Adam is actually from the Bible. I think the image works. It's still a little mystifying, about Adam and paradises and so on in this sort of post-human future, it seems. But that phrase is from the New Testament and it's used of Christ. Christ is the second Adam. So there's actually a messianic tone here evoked. And it's a Messiah who's searching rather than sort of saving, it would seem, surrounded by monsters and trying to find these lost paradises of a reborn son, some kind of Edenic that's based in the primordial or something along those lines. Yeah, it's just an intriguing image, and I think most people would take the ending as downbeat and maybe bleak. And I definitely take it that way to some degree, but I think there's just a touch of ambivalence there that makes it a little more interesting than just pure bleakness. Although pure bleakness can be interesting, it depends on how it's done. And I'm going to be talking a lot about this whole question of bleakness and hope and so on in coming videos, because the other SF novels that I've read recently are extremely bleak, and Lafferty's novel that I'm covering, Past Master, ends on a note of ambivalent hope. And there's this whole question of, SF, is it meant to do nihilism? Is it meant to do bleakness? Can it do hope? Et cetera, et cetera. And in what ways, Anyway, really good novel. Highly recommend it. I'm looking forward to reading more Ballard. Let me know what you thought of the novel if you've read it, or Ballard in general, or anything else about the topics raised here. And thanks a lot for watching.